Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Nahliah Webber, and I'm the Executive Director of the Orleans Public Education Network. We are a local nonprofit that does policy advocacy, working with families and communities to stay engaged in the public education conversation so that we all can work towards and fight for equitable and just education policy and practice. This is a part of our installment of Public Education Week, a week-long event series where we engage multiple and many various community members in the conversation around equity and excellence in our public education system. And I'm very excited about this conversation that we're going to have, hosted by Rachel Guidry, who is going to host this panel of esteemed colleagues and guests around increasing stakeholder communication so that the public is better and more aware of education policy as it's happening and not just as an afterthought, again, with the purpose of making sure that people are engaged and working towards more equitable and just outcomes for our students and families. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who's going to introduce our panel, and we are going to get started.
Thank you, Nahliah. I appreciate you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for everyone who's joining us today for the webinar. I'm your host and the moderator, Rachel Guidry, and I'm the lead consultant at RSWG Consulting. Among other things, we're an advisory firm that excels in organizational and policy development. So today we're presenting Linking Policy to Purpose, a do better, let's do better discussion on stakeholder communications. We're doing this in partnership with OPEN, Orleans Public Education Network, for Public Education Week, as Nahliah mentioned. So for anyone who'd like to submit questions or any comments for the panelists or for me, your moderator, please do so in the Q&A link that's at the bottom of your screen. We won't be responding to chat. We won't be responding to the hands raised. This is going to be a pretty ongoing discussion for the length of time, so we don't want to be pulled away from the good content that we'll be getting throughout the course of the discussion. So with that said, let's push on forward. So we're looking forward to some productive work today. And we hope that today's conversation prompts a lot of work for many years to come. Today's panelists are some former cohort and colleagues of mine, as well as a couple of current. So starting in order of ladies first, we're talking with Dr. Vera Triplett, the founder and CFO of Noble Minds Institute for Whole Child Learning. We have Mrs. Caroline Roemer Shirley. She's the Executive Director of Louisiana Association of Public Charter Schools. We have Dr. Darryl Kilbert, retired Superintendent of Orleans Parish School Board. And we also have Dr. Raynard Sanders. He is the enlightened author and the host of the New Orleans Imperative talk show. We'll also have some pre-recorded content to add here and there from Mr. David Cash, who's a professional educator in the NOLA in the NOLA public school system at this time. So thank you all, panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for taking the time to offer your insights. All right, well, pull up the presentation. And y'all, please bear with me. I'm fighting a sinus infection. So I'm sounding pretty nasal and my words sound a little off sometimes, but here we are. All right, so today's discussion, we're highlighting existing problems in information distribution regarding the structure, governance, operations, performance, and accountability of NOLA public schools. Today's panelists will engage in focused dialogue about public education policy and the significance of upholding stakeholder communications. So by the end of our live session, we'll arrive at solutions for accurate and transparent information sharing that benefits the entire education community. Panelists, I've pursued each of you for this particular event because I believe you're the best professionals available to engage in continuing this work beyond our good intentions. So I'd like for us to converse with each other very candidly about the topics at hand. And I'm going to ask the questions, and I will be honored and delighted if you all would just answer them for me. Is that agreeable for everyone?
Yes.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Well, let's get started, y'all. So this is me. I'm Rachel Guidry. As I mentioned, I'm the lead consultant at RSWG Consulting. We actually engage as a stakeholder in community advocacy, and that includes education advocacy projects with some nonprofit and other government entities throughout the greater New Orleans area. The agenda for today, we're going to talk about why we're here. We're going to have a little background information for the sake of everyone who's engaged as a viewer or a listener. And we'll go ahead and get to the meat of the work. We'll talk about what's ahead, what we've identified as problems, the consequences that we're paying as a result. We'll arrive at some solutions for how we can fix those problems. And we'll talk about what we're willing to do moving forward on that. We'll also talk about what we take away from what everyone's engaged in that dialogue. And then we'll be done with the presentation. So why are we here, y'all? We're talking about communication today for stakeholders. If we don't have communication, then we're going to end up nowhere. And that's in any industry, but especially in the vital work that goes into educating students. The more information that we share, the better we do. However, we're coming across situations that demonstrate we're not taking advantage of that fact. We understand as a group, as stakeholders, that there are so many hands in the pot that want to be in the pot or disengage from the pot, that it's difficult to take all of that collective thought and expertise and move it forward as policy and actions and even curricula that help our education system become the best it could possibly be. It is difficult, but it is doable. There are professionals available, as well as those seasoned educators who are willing to put in the work, put in the time, and see that particular work through. And of course, we're here because we're all stakeholders. Whether we're educators or students or business owners like myself, we have a stake in how New Orleans children are educated, and we want to make sure that the future is secure for our children, and their peers as well. So just a little bit of information background for those who are engaged with us. Our panelists know all this stuff. They're pretty well seasoned, and I'm totally enjoying being in the room with them right now. But just so we know that when we talk about who stakeholders are, we're talking about everyone from the student to the parent, to the teachers, to the administrators, to policymakers, legislators, and those who are engaged on other levels, economic developers, land developers, city government, state government, business owners. That is the whole picture of what it looks like to be a part of the public education community. As far as who makes the rules and the policies that we will be incorporating in our discussion today, that information is coming directly from Louisiana State Legislature, Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, Orleans Parish School Board, which is now transitioned to NOLA Public Schools. They make the rules, the existing policies that they have in place that have a stake and a hold in whether or not we're actually communicating and or contributing to the improvement of our school system comes directly from them. So if you have any questions about that, please make sure to include them in the Q&A. So I want to highlight just for a second, y'all, as a part of the preface to begin our discussion, how we're changing structure as far as governance. Back in 2014-15, when we're about 8 to 9 years into the major shift that we've made as an entire city into the new school structures, we're looking at how governance looked back then. And at that point, we still had the Recovery School District governing most of the schools at 70% back in that particular school year. Most of the charters, just a bit over half, were network charter schools, but the bulk of them were in fact charter schools by then. Fast forward just 4 years, there have been significant changes. We don't see Recovery School District as a major factor anymore in the governance of schools. We have OPSB carrying governance of most of the schools in the district at this point. And we also see now that Cowan Institute has offered more information on the changes that are happening at the school level as far as which schools are added, which are closed. For the school year that we're in right now, even between last school year and this particular school year, significant changes have been made. We can see last year that we had 3 school closures located at the bottom right of the screen. And at this point, we've got 7 closed schools. Not much has changed in the fact that OPSB, which is now transitioned to NOLA Public Schools, is governing the majority of schools, but now we have no direct run schools throughout the city. So there's a whole lot that's going on that what we're experiencing is under communicated to the stakeholder community. If anyone has any questions about that, you can also include that in your Q&A inquiry. So needless to say, there are a bunch of problems that we've identified so far. In the work that I've done to review policy, and we're talking about policies written in Act 91 from the state legislature, charter school bulletins 126 and 74 from Bessie Act 28, OPSB and NOLA public school policies. I have not seen provisions made to engage stakeholders in accountability or communications measures. Some of the problems we've identified in not having stakeholder communications included or upheld for that matter is that there's no transparency secured. Stakeholders go on not properly informed about the way schools are run or what's produced from schools. And there's a big part of this where monopolizing of the narrative behind how schools are doing is taken on by special interest groups, which actually tends to take away from the focus on how children are served at schools and how that plays its best possible part in creating an effective school system. So there's a question here. The question I'd like to pose to get started, and if you will, Caroline, I'd like to hear from you first, and then Vera. Why aren't stakeholders engaged given the critical state of affairs?
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for having me in the discussion today. As a former board member for Open and having done work with you over the years, it's exciting to be included. So I do appreciate it, and I recognize we won't agree on everything, but I feel like I've always had I'll call positive interactions with people like Dr. Sanders and others on these types of issues. And I feel like through these types of conversations is how we're going to drive better policy and get better, let's say, outcomes for students and families in New Orleans. And so jumping right in on your question, I guess I want to start, Rachel, with I'm not sure I agree with you. And I know you won't be surprised by that. But I think it would be helpful for either this panel or as we go through this, for your audience to think about what's your definition of engagement. I think that's a really important one. And just like we sometimes have conversations around, identifying what quality means, what choice means, I would say you have to define engagement. And so I would like to frame out for this conversation, and maybe that's you as our facilitator, to give me that definition so I can answer and be responsive to that versus maybe something else.
Sure. All right. Well, for the sake of this particular discussion, we want to look at engagement as the involvement of another person, another entity, another group in how things are going. Accountability measures that I've seen, according to the policy that I reviewed, don't include those measures that say, here's how we're going to make sure other persons are taking part in this process. So that's the spirit of engagement that I'm coming from in using that particular term.
Got you. So you're suggesting that, I'm sorry, Rachel, I didn't mean to speak over you.
No worries.
So when you talk about not seeing a policy, I just want to make sure I get this right. You're suggesting that there should be policy or law specifically directing either a school district, a charter school, whatever entity we're talking about, to somehow engage the public, the community, parents, in decisions being made about the school system and the schools? Like, I guess I'm still confused at what exactly are you seeing not there? Because I'll put just one simple example on the table. So both the elected school board and charter school boards have to follow public meeting law. I'll use that one as a simple example of a way people can engage in policy making. The legislature's under public meeting law, Bessie, our school board, and our charters. So to me, that's one avenue by which people could engage in what is taking place either at a district system level or inside a school or at the law level. So I would place that as just, again, an example of engagement through a policy, actually through a law that's required.
Do you want me to respond, Caroline?
I figured we would probably have a conversation today.
Sure.
So yes,
Sure.
I would love to have that conversation.
Sure. Well, the reason that I'm bringing up the existence of it being written into policy at the state and local level is because if the rule doesn't exist, we're not exactly inclined to take it on or enforce it, right? So we have the rule that says there should be public meetings, okay? And yes, that is a way that people can engage. But if those public meetings are held in locations or at times that are inconvenient for the average parent, and by average parent, I mean someone who has a job, works a shift that is going on during the time of those public meetings, or transportation being an issue given the time or location of the meeting, then it's more difficult to engage. And that's a part of engagement that hasn't been revisited, checked, or changed since it's been installed. So the reason that I'm using policy as the premise for the existence of engagement, stakeholder communications, is because we don't have it written to make those provisions and do a little better than just offering a public meeting, or change the structure of public meetings so that it's required to be offered in ways that are more open to more people to take part in.
So Rachel, am I allowed to now jump in? Because I know you said I was gonna be asked as well. So
Absolutely.
What I would say is that I am inclined to agree with Caroline in part, that there are policies that exist that have the intention of increasing stakeholder engagement. And by stakeholders, because I'm a person that runs a school, for me, my most important stakeholder is my parent, my family. I do think, though, that regardless of what the policy is, where we have more work to do is around actors and intention, right? And so you can have a policy. There is always a way for folks that are intentional bad actors to get around that policy. So the policy may very well be that we have to have an open meeting and those meetings have to be publicized. But let's say, for instance, you are, as per your example, having your meeting in the middle of the day, so it's very difficult for most people, as you mentioned, to leave their job and get to a meeting that happens at noon, in the middle of the day, perhaps even on the other side of town. And I'll use board meetings as an example, but I think that there are other examples of this. One of the things that, for example, we were doing initially is we were having our board meetings in the evening at right around 5:30. If you remember, we were pretty much, I don't want to use the word exiled, but that's for the most part what it was, to a space where we had not done much work on the West Bank. Many of our parents who lived on the East Bank found it very difficult to make it to those meetings because of both the time and the transportation. Who wants to come onto the West Bank or across the Greater New Orleans Bridge at 5:30? We then decided that we would move our meetings to the morning. And so we moved our meetings to 9 a.m. We started advertising them not just on our website, but also posting the meetings up on the school door so that parents that were dropping off could see the meetings, and also putting them on our Facebook page. And as a result of that, we got a little more public participation, if you will. And even, to be perfectly honest with you, board participation, because our board members were better able to make a meeting that was in the morning before they actually went into the office versus trying to get out of the office to get to a meeting. So I think that there are policies and then there are intentions. And so the policy, may state something very specific, but the intention of the person that has to enact that policy or make sure that that policy is put into place is the thing that we need to be looking at. And so I think what we need to be having more conversations about is, how are folks that are in the position to implement policies that would increase engagement, how are they actually implementing? What steps are they taking to make sure that the policy is actually working for the people that they need to work for? As I said, for me, my most important stakeholder as a school leader is my parent. And so we are always looking for ways to engage our parents that work for them. Many of our parents are on the younger side and use social media. So we use social media a lot. We use our Facebook page, we use Twitter, we use Instagram. We also allow our parents to call in for meetings if they can't make it in person. And we don't hold those things against them. And so I think that, again, if your intention is to really have folks be engaged, you will do all of the things that you need to do to make sure that that happens.
Understood. I appreciate that, Dr. Vera, because I appreciate most that you brought up the differentiation between what exists in policy and what we intend to do. And that really comes to the base of, this particular part of the talk, is that I keep on reinforcing that part on policy not being there, because in spite of our intentions change from one school, from one entity, from one legislative body to another. The intentions change. And the outcome of those changes in intention has been that, on the other side of that, as a parent, as a business owner, as a grandmother now, I'm not allowed to engage the way that I'd like to. And I'm using allowed loosely, because there aren't the provisions there for me to do so. There's a lot of things for me to consider in my time and how I'm able to engage. And I'm saying this as, you know, someone who has always been involved in how schools are run and what's happening at the schools. And I mean, from the teacher level to the legislative level. So, Dr. Sanders, is there anything you'd like to put in regards to the problems that we found in communications?
Well, you know, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I think that what we say and what we do are two different things. And when you start talking about stakeholders, and when I first read about, you know, when you asked me to be on here, you know, who are the stakeholders?
Right.
You know, who are the people that are at the table that have been making decisions? Now, since November 29th, 2005, up until July of 2018, the people that were making the decisions was a board that met in Baton Rouge and that had meetings at 10 a.m. in the morning. Two of those board members represented New Orleans, but many of those board members couldn't find one school from the other, much less to make decisions about New Orleans. So since 2005, and I said all of that to say this, since 2005, you know, the word stakeholders have been removed from this whole reform process. And in fact, it's been a few people that have been making stakeholders without public participation. So as you talk about, well, you know, you're a grandparent and you're doing this, that, and the other, right? The whole environment for participation has changed since 2005, such that as we fast forward today to 2019, we have some charter schools that notify parents about things, some charter schools that don't. Some charter schools say when they have public meetings, some that don't. We have parents that come and they say, well, you know, my school is closing next week. Nobody never talked with us about that, right? And how many times have we heard that, right? So, you know, I think this, we need to redefine stakeholders moving forward, as you say, this webinar is about, to what stakeholders really mean. And we really need to talk about engagement as it is happening on the ground. Not only as it is written in policy, but how does it flow out on the ground, right? And I think all of us can attest to the fact that we've been hearing numerous complaints about issues around the public not being involved in this public education reform system that we have post-Katrina. And I think that's the elephant in the room. So we can say, well, we got a policy, but, we got to understand that for some of these charter schools, policies don't mean anything. We had a policy about special needs kids. We wound up in a class action lawsuit and settled because we had charter schools that would not service special needs kids. So what exactly is happening on the ground? And I think that is much more important than what is written in writing. Not to say that I don't have a problem with some of the stuff that's in writing too.
Can I ask, do we think, I'm sorry, Rachel.
Go right ahead.
I hear that, and I know things aren't always the way they should be, or as we've talked about, intentions versus reality. But do we think that we're seeing engagement? And I know New Orleans is charters, but this is Public Ed Week. So I'm going to go a little broader and talk about public education as someone that is with a statewide organization. So I go to school board meetings across the state. I go to the legislature. I go to the BESI. I mean, would this panel agree that I think we have a problem with engagement in public ed in general, whether it's charter schools or not, just traditional publics? I am not seeing If we're talking engagement with the definition being engaged in policy decisions, the legislature itself meets, a certain time of year, committees at 9 in the morning, sometimes 10 at night. And I rarely see parents physically there. My guess is most parents, and to Dr. Sanders' point, whoever the stakeholders aren't even aware of what's going to be discussed. So I would make the argument that yes, New Orleans is all charters. Yes, there are things that can be done better specifically to New Orleans. I don't think it's necessarily always a charter school problem. I think it's a public education problem in general of what are the expectations either that schools have of, as Dr. Triplett said, her primary concern, parents, or is it taxpayers, et cetera. I don't see the level always of, very hands-on. I'm a mom, I have a 6th grader, and I would tell you for me, engagement is, at least as it's related to Owen, is that I get him to school every day, we do our homework, I attend parent-teacher conferences, I'm engaged at that level. And so I think I'm gonna keep harping on, I think we have to define what engagement means, and to Dr. Sanders' point, which stakeholders are we talking about?
And also big P policy and little p policy.
I like
Right.
that.
So to your point, Carolyn, you're not going to find in any school system that I've worked in a lot of parents really engaged on the state level or in terms of those policies, but hyper engaged on maybe the school level with, again, various amounts of variation on the district level. So I think there are a multitude of stakeholders. There's business, there's their children, students, there's families, parents, there's also, business stakeholders. There are, higher ed. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of stakeholders with all varying levels of engagement. But I think that when we see a variation in engagement, I think that we're also seeing a variation of power and authority and the ability to change, to have an effect on policy. And we have a lot of parents who, and rightfully think that, I can't necessarily make a very big difference necessarily on a state level. Like what am I going to accomplish by driving 45 minutes to Baton Rouge and sitting in a Bessie meeting? Will they listen to me? Will they hear me? Do I actually have the power to change things there? Versus, do I have the power with the other parents in my school building to change policies on that school level? And so I think that when we're talking about engagement and stakeholders, again, it's like, what stakeholders are we talking about? There are multiple ones. What level of engagement? They engage on various different levels, but also perceived notions of power and the ability to change things will then dictate in large part, or influence a large part, where and how people position themselves.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Nahliah, for helping us to define that, especially moving forward in how this is getting done. I am attempting to pull up my presentation, y'all. Bear with me. Here we go. All right, we don't have any questions from the audience just right now, so we're going to move forward. So as a result of the problems that we've identified, even in this discussion about stakeholders and communications, defining them, and actually addressing them as they come along, as they have come along in this new series of school systems. We experience a good bit of consequences in how this is coming across. The cherry picking of the way information is output to the general public. Solutions that are really geared towards how successful a school is and the competitive environment that fosters. Accountability is set in place, but there's no standard rule book that we're observing, and I'm talking about as a parent, as a business owner, as a stakeholder in general. We're not seeing accountability measures developed and pre-developed with the best practices set in mind. And all of that leads to stakeholder apathy. People have a tendency to run away from the things that they don't understand, are not allowed to engage in, or are turned away from because of frustration. You know, things like lawsuits send people away from wanting to be involved. So for this particular questions coming up, Raynard, I'd like to throw this one to you. Where is there a current structure for communications? Do you know of a plan that engages stakeholders who've been excluded or misinformed?
Well, in regards to that first question, you know, I really believe that the whole reform movement, a so-called reform movement that was implemented in New Orleans, was done with a disregard for community input, a disregard in terms of what the community wanted. So when you look at even what we were talking about earlier, a school board that met 80 plus miles outside New Orleans and met at times that was inconvenient for New Orleans and for the residents to participate. And when you look at how schools were opened and closed, how decisions were made in regards to what schools they were going to open back up in what communities, that was not done in a manner that involved any communication process.
Mm.
Okay? So, you know, moving forward, you know, what we need to realize is that you can't fix anybody. You can't come into a community and say, I'm going to fix you, and then do it. And then when everything doesn't work, you know, blame the people or blame this, that, and the other. But if you don't have any open communications around whatever kind of endeavor that you're going to do, then, you know, you're going to have some problems, particularly when you are supposedly providing our most important public service, which is public education.
Mm.
Yet we have historically disengaged the communication with the parents and the community members that make up this particular community. Okay, so, you know, what the current structure is at this point, are we gonna run some meetings and just say, oh, we listen to them and then go back and do what we wanna do? Really don't know where we're at with that. In terms of, you know, to engage stakeholders, you know, what we need to realize is that the problems that parents are having with schools have a lot to do with, number one, they have set a precedent that parents are not important.
Mm.
And I'm not talking about any individual school, but that's what the state did. And that's what we did with Act 35. Didn't need you all. Didn't want your participation. We're going to straighten you guys out. The other thing is that, you know, we have taken our communities and we have basically disenfranchised them. We have kids that are going everywhere. We have parents with children in 2 schools, 3 schools. We have parents trying to figure out, well, which meeting they're gonna go to, which uniform, everything. So, you know, I just believe that, you know, the first thing is that this school district is not working, was not working pre-Katrina, and is not working now. You can't come in, anybody can't come in. I can't go in anywhere and fix something and not involve the historic key stakeholders that are involved with that community. The other thing is that relationship has to be a relationship that is done with trust, and has to be done under some kind of environment where the stakeholders feel that they have some meaningful participation. Not some meetings where we give the community 2 options, and if you don't do one, we're gonna do the other one. But, you know, it has to be an environment where there's some collaboration, okay? Post-Katrina, we have not seen that kind of collaboration. So that's why we have all of these problems now. That is probably why we're having this webinar as we're having right now, merely because this is a system that, number one, does not respect and want to include stakeholders in the decision-making process. Number two, we have unelected charter boards where they are self-appointing each other. Number three, we have a policy, a state policy here that gives the charter boards autonomy, I mean, unquestionable autonomy, that the school board has no authority over daily practice. So we really, quite honestly, with you, rethink this whole thing and rethink in terms of how we're going to improve this school district and how we're going to level the playing field for those kids that have historically been left behind, which are poor and minority children, and make sure that we include special needs kids in this whole thing. So we need to rethink this whole thing. So I know I might have went around the corner, but the current communications, you know, we have had no communications. Not that is not of any worth that this community feels engaged. And in terms of the stakeholders, they have been excluded. They continue to be excluded by policy and by practice.
Rachel, would you mind if I just, because I don't have much longer to be on. So there were a couple of things that Dr. Sanders said that that I just sort of had a reaction to, that I wanted to respond to. Okay. So the first thing I want to say is that in 2005, I had 3 children in school, three children in 3 different schools.
Okay.
My youngest was in a selective entry Montessori school. My middle daughter was in a sort of traditional public school. It was a charter school at the time. And my son was attending a private school. And the reason for that is because they all needed something different. And there was no one school. By the way, none of them went to school near our home. We had, at that time, 3 schools near our home. And everywhere that my children went to school, I had to drive to get them there. And this was pre-Katrina. And so I do agree with Dr. Sanders when he says that there was a lot that was done post-Katrina without regard for community input. I think that what I take issue with is that there was a disregard for what the community wanted, because I can tell you that I was struggling as a parent and as a married parent. I have a husband, I have for, you know, all of the years that I've had children. And it for the 2 of us, it was a struggle because we were scrambling to find schools that were good fits for our children, and we could not send them. We did not feel safe sending them to a school that was, at the time, I lied to you not, directly across from our home. And there were many, many people in the community, you know, that were having that same struggle. My younger sister has 3 sons that are autistic. And she was having the same struggle. So I feel like there was something that needed for sure to change. I don't think that the mechanism, the model was the best. And I do think that there were people that were in many ways damaged, their reputations, their psyches by all of these things that were happening. But I do also think that we had a problem. We don't have a perfect system now, but we certainly did not have a perfect system then. I agree that there are issues with boards. I'm a charter school leader. I have a charter school board that is not elected. They were selected, but they were selected for various reasons. I, for example, am a school that does not suspend or expel children. And I needed to have board members, people on my board that understood that. And so as a result, I have people that are on my board that have worked in the juvenile justice system, who are social workers, who have worked to get people off death row, who work for the Innocence Project. I have people who understand the impact of over disciplining young children, right? And so I think that that is a pro for being able to select your board members, because then you get to select people who, from a model standpoint, are aligned with your thought process. So my thought process is that suspension and expulsion does not serve children well at any time under any circumstances. I am also a school that caters to special needs kids. So for a school that is my size, I have about 103, 104 students that currently attend my school. About 20% of those students are special needs and high need special needs. So at the upper end of the autism spectrum, and pervasive developmental disorders and behavioral disorders of various types. Children who other schools would not take. I have a little boy whose mom drives from LaPlace to bring him to my building every day because she had been unsuccessful in other schools. And so under those circumstances, I think that what we currently have does work, because we do have an option and opportunity for families that before did not have options or opportunities, quite frankly. Is it perfect? No. Is there a lot of work to do? Yes. Are there bad actors? Absolutely. Absolutely, there are bad actors. In fact, I would own that in the past, I was a bad actor, because there was a time when I thought that school needed to look and feel a certain way to be successful. And I had to make a change after I saw that what was happening was not what I wanted to or had intended to happen. And so we needed to do some things differently. I also don't think that people are not engaged because they don't want to be, or because they're not sophisticated enough to understand. I think quite frankly, people are daunted by the amount of effort that it takes now to just send their kids to school. You know, once upon a time, you could send your children to school, you could feel that they were safe while they were there, and you could feel comfortable that they were going to learn what they needed to learn. And you as a parent who had the responsibility of feeding them and clothing them and sheltering them could focus on those things that you felt were your adult responsibilities, and that you could trust the school to do what they needed to do. Now we want parents to do their jobs and ours. And I think that's daunting. And I think that, you know, engagement in many ways is in the eye of the beholder. A parent that gets their child to me every single day, that's an engaged parent, because they have to, there's some effort that is involved with that, right? My students are very young, right? This year we're kindergarten through 4th grade, so they cannot get themselves up for the most part and get themselves ready. So to me, that is engagement. I do have parents that have the means and the opportunity and the information and could drive to Baton Rouge. They simply do not want to. They don't choose to. And in some cases, they don't choose to because they're getting what they need from me here at the school. And so they don't feel the need to go to Baton Rouge and rally about something because they feel like their needs are being met in the environment where they send their school every day. And I do believe that when parents feel that way, when they feel that at the school level, their concerns are acknowledged and dealt with, that whatever they may be, whether it may be safety concerns or academic concerns or concerns with a teacher or whatever, I do feel like when people feel like they are getting the information at the school level, they feel less inclined, or they feel like it is less necessary. I think when people feel that they need to be more engaged, particularly parents, I'm talking more now about parents than I'm talking about other stakeholders, other people that are sort of, you know, more invested in the politics of education. You know, parents are invested in the policy of education to the extent that it impacts their children. They tend to leave the politics to other people. And whether or not that's a good or a bad thing, because the politics ultimately impact the policy. But again, you know, they in most cases, and I was a parent that felt that way too. In most cases, I felt that my job was to get my child to the building in the best way possible, and to show up when I was needed. But even as a parent with a PhD who worked in the school system, I wasn't driving out to Baton Rouge or even onto the West Bank to attend meetings. I was going to the school to have my concerns addressed. And so I think that's why it's important, incredibly important, because what my parents will say to you, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn saying this, is they really don't care that I'm a charter school or who chartered me, or, you know, they don't care about any of that. Here's what they care about. They care that they can send their children here, traditionally developing or special needs, and feel safe, and feel that their children are wanted and that they're getting the education that they deserve. They care that even if their child makes a mistake, that they're not going to have to miss 3 days of work because I'm not going to put them out of school for 3 to 5 days.
Right.
That's what they care about. And so I think if we start to address at the school level the things that are, I think, very real concerns, and many of them that Dr. Sanders brought up, I think they're really very salient concerns. But if we would address those things at the school level, then we wouldn't have to figure out how to get people in droves down to Baton Rouge. You know, we wouldn't have to figure out how to get people in droves over across the river to meetings, because people would feel heard and seen by the place that they send their kids to school at every day. And I really do believe that that's where stakeholder engagement has to begin. You know, so I mean, I feel like that was a lot, but that's just sort of how I feel about it. I think we all know that none of us, I don't think anybody on this call is ever going to agree about the way that things were done or how they were done. I think everybody has their pros and cons about that. Here is where we are now, though. And we've got children and parents showing up to schools every single day. And we've got policymakers and politicians arguing about the same things all the time. And in a lot of ways, not making things any better for the child and the parent. That's what we're here for. You know, that's our job. So if we see a problem, we have to solve it. I felt like there was a problem. The suspension and expulsion rate was a problem. What is the way that I could solve it? I could start a school that didn't suspend or expel children. People serving special needs children and wanting them and welcoming them was a problem. How can I help to solve that? So that wasn't something that was solved at a state policy level. You know, Bessie didn't tell me that I had to not expel or suspend children. In fact, they were quite surprised that that was something that I wanted to not do. However, at the school level and at my board level, I was able to put people in place, not only my board members, but also my faculty and staff, who upon being hired, understand that I'm not going to suspend or expel children. And that means even if they do something that you don't like and think is a suspendable offense. So when you sign off to work here, you are signing off on the fact that we don't kick children out of school at any time for any reason. Again, that's not a state policy. That's a Noble Minds Vera Triplett policy.
Understood.
So how do we get to that granular level? Because clearly we've been trying to force a square peg into a round hole since reform started.
Again.
And it's just not working. We can argue about it. People can make Facebook pages and erase the board and, you know, attack people and malign people. None of that is getting us to where we need to be. And what's so frustrating to me about that is that kids are dying every day, like literally dying in the streets. Kids are being jailed every single day. And we're still arguing the politics.
Yes.
nope, none of us is going to all be satisfied with what's going on around the policy. It's just not going to happen. I just don't.
I understand and I agree. I agree, Vera, because we're people and we're different people and we come from different backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences. So the ability to agree to disagree is something that we have to work on as adults at a basic level, as adults, which is why this communications discussion is so important, because we need to come together on how we can move forward in our communications. I think one thing I want to make sure that we point out is the teacher perspective in what's happening with our communications as well. So give me a second. I'm going to pull up an excerpt from Mr. Dave Cash about how information is put out. Let me see. Bear with me.
Before we get into that, I wanted to respond to, something that Dr. Vera Triplett was talking about that made me want to respond. When you're talking about the intentionality around your board and the intentionality around the culture of your school, and how you're very transparent about that. And when we're talking about like stakeholder communications with parents in particular, like you have a reason, an intentional reason around why your board looks the way that it does and why your school functions the way that it does, that you can articulate. It's probably written down somewhere. I think what we often come into contact with in terms of parents that reach out to us is it seems like a lot of things at the schools that they're attending are mysterious, right? They don't really know the board members. They don't know why they were selected. They don't know what they were there to do. It's usually, until something happens and the lens is reporting on it. Like, this is how some parents are finding out what is going on behind the scenes at their schools. And so we're talking about stakeholder communications. I think that it's a question of like intentions, just like you said, but then also the transparency and demystifying things for families, where they do know why the school is set up the way that it is, why the culture is what it is, what the expectations are, and that information is made plain, simple, and readily available. I think so. Stakeholder, and it does start on the school level, because that is where parents are interacting with the school system the most, with those individual schools. And so that is the opportunity to demystify all of it, and yet parents are often confused. So how do we set a standard across that, where it's not based on one particular school leader being transparent in developing an equitable, open enrollment school that's really about protecting children's civil rights? How do we get to a place where the system itself, where it is the expectation that no matter what school you open for whatever reason, parents have this kind of information, and it's not based on whether or not your school leader just happens to be really intentional about that?
Nahliah, I think to that question, and I think we're also seeing this on the national level.
I hate to interrupt, but we're running short on time. So please, Vera, I want you to respond, but please limit your response to just under a minute, please.
I will. And so here's what I'll say to that. You can't legislate morality.
Not at all.
And so when when boards are selecting, and I think that part of the problem, and I'm going to try to do this very quickly. Part of the problem is it's been a flipped, right? And so it used to be that boards hired the CEO, and the CEO was supposed to represent the druthers of the board, for lack of a better word. Well, now what we have is that the CEO comes first, and then the CEO chooses the board. Mm-hmm. And so when you have that kind of a flip, then the board is for sure going to reflect the values of the CEO versus the CEO reflecting the values of the board. And so for better or worse, Orleans Parish has a school board that is elected, and then that school board gets to hire a superintendent that they think will reflect their values and what they want to see happen with the school system. In the charter school system, and this is one of the flaws of the charter school system, bottom line, that is sort of a flipped process. And so as a result of that, when you do have leaders that are intentional or unintentional bad actors, and when I say unintentional bad actors, it's I really believe that this is the best way. I'm not really trying to do harm. I really believe that this is the best way, even though it's not. So that's my answer. I know that was over a minute.
Okay, no worries. And Vera, I appreciate that because you actually led into what I want to call the opposite, the other side of the teacher spectrum from that perspective. Vera, you happen to represent an exception to the rule. And that's intentional for this particular discussion because we need to hear what the exception to the rule sounds and looks like. You are emanating that on a daily basis at your school. And by far, appreciation doesn't express my particular viewpoint of that work. But what exists, and I'm gonna play Dave Cash's excerpt right now, is there's another side at play in this. And this is the part where we're addressing a problem that has consequences for which we're about to work on a solution after we hear from Dave. And then I definitely want to hear from Dr. Kilbert. Darryl, I need you to follow Dave in how we're talking about the consequences of not having stakeholder communications where we ideally want them to be in this present moment in the education community.
One of the things about this system is that by creating a system where schools are pitted against each other in competition for seats and for survival and renewal of charter, it gives schools a lot of incentive to not share what they learn. And when charter schools were first invented, the idea was new. The idea was that charter schools would be like sort of the exception, not the rule, and charter schools would be a place where schools could be innovative, but then the innovations that were developed in those schools could then be shared with the larger education community as a way to help the whole system benefit from these sort of pockets of innovation. But the problem with the way the system's designed now, in my opinion, is that it creates instead of fostering a sense of collaboration in education, which I think is super important. I think it's the only really effective way for large scale things like cities to grow in terms of their educational outcomes, is for teachers to collaborate across schools. Instead, what you have is schools that do sort of figure out something, and then they're very they hold it close to the vest. They say, well, we can't share our reading strategies with you because it's proprietary, because we want to make sure that we can continue to operate as a school. So that makes it difficult, but there isn't a spirit of collaboration. One of the things that's nice about the United Teachers of New Orleans, our union, is that we have members across all the schools in the city, and those members can come together at UTNO, and we can talk about some of the things that are working and share them with each other. But the schools don't have, in my experience, largely, it's not, there might be some schools that have decided to partner with each other, but there's no rule that says whatever you learn, you have to share. It's treated more like intellectual property of a business than it is sort of publicly shareable research that can benefit everyone.
Okay. Dr. Darryl Kilbert, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to share in regards to this particular portion of the discussion?
Got to turn his mic on.
We're not hearing you, Dr. Kilbert. Do you have your, okay, you're muted. Now unmute. Okay. Oh, you're muted again. Try again. Okay. Yes.
Okay, very good. And good afternoon, colleagues. Everyone has brought up some interesting points. And the point I want to make with each of us is that we talk about the word communication, and I'd like, as an old English teacher, I'd like to take the root of that word, and that is commune. And when we talk about communes, we're talking about people getting together and having dialogue with one another. And unfortunately, we are, as educators, and someone mentioned it earlier about the importance of education and being engaged, is that we are probably one of the few entities that everybody else makes decisions about us, simply because they went to school. We have politicians making decisions about us. We have businesses making decisions about us. We have all persons making decisions about education. But educators are the best people, I would think, to make decisions about what goes on in education. I'm glad to be a part of this discussion because we're talking about educators here who are dialoguing with one another, and whether or not we agree with one another, we all still want the same end result, and that is a quality education for our children. Listen to Vera talk about the no suspension and no expulsion. How many schools would actually want to do that? But under her guise and under her leadership, those decisions are being made for the children that she services. So that works for her. And nobody else made that decision for her but her and her community, her staff, her parents, her engaged stakeholders. So unless we engage the people who are most involved and most impacted and most affected, then we're going to continue to go around in circles by allowing those political entities, and why politics always has to be engaged in the teaching and learning process behooves me. But since it does, how do we get decisions made that will impact the politicians to say, okay, these are the people who are best suited to make those decisions. Let's support them. Let's provide them with the resources. Let's provide them with the support. Let's provide them with the necessary day-to-day kinds of things that they need to make all children, just not one or two here, or two or three there, or those who have been cherry-picked, but all young people to be engaged. And I think someone used the word a few minutes ago, equitable as opposed to equal. We have to provide the right resources for children based upon their needs. We had a big discussion at the beginning of this school year about how schools would be funded and differentiated funding, particularly for students who were of special needs, who do need more services than what a young person that would not need those particular services. So until we start making decisions, having decisions made by people who are best suited to make those decisions, we're going to continue to go around in circles.
I appreciate your input, Dr. Kilbert. That was a mouthful, actually, saying, because that kind of narrows how we look at stakeholders then, doesn't it? If we're saying that the persons who are currently making decisions for and about schools need to be those who have operated from schools, then what does that say about those who may be professionals or just interested community members who want to have a stake in the way education is delivered for the sake of the community?
Certainly they need to be engaged, certainly need to be aware of what's going on. And that's one of the things that, and it got mentioned again multiple times about people having to go to Baton Rouge or having to go to the West Bank. I was fortunate enough to be the superintendent where meetings were on the East Bank, where the majority of the stakeholders and the community members were. So we had a greater number of people participating. However, now people tend to participate when there is some alarm that has been sounded about a particular item. You know, if we can sit down and agree to disagree, but have the same end result, which I think all of us want, an end result, and that is to have young people who are productive in whatever arena they so choose to go in, and that they can be successful to be able to take care of themselves. And as Vera mentioned, not be arrested and incarcerated. And let's take this from a different perspective. We are spending minimally $60,000 a year to incarcerate someone who may be incarcerated for a year. On the other end of the spectrum, you know, we're spending less than $10,000 to educate a child per year. Something's wrong with that picture there. You know, maybe if we flip that around, we might not have as many people incarcerated as we do now, because we can't arrest ourselves out of crime, but we can certainly educate ourselves out of crime.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. We're about to transition over to the solutions portion of this conversation, everyone. And in doing so, I want to point out that we all know that this is not a one-size-fits-all situation. We know and understand that diversified thought has to be allowed to flourish. And that we have to be able to move forward with that in mind. Give me a second, y'all. I'm working this through. We don't have any questions from our audience at this time. So let's go ahead and move forward to the solutions. I really want to kick this particular part back to you, Dr. Kilbert. Let's talk about how we can assure that we're providing information in a way that's useful, transparent, accurate, timely to those stakeholders who desire to be involved and would otherwise have an opportunity to be involved if we were not in this particular combative environment. What can we do to fix this situation?
I think you heard Dave Cash say a few things that are important. One, we have teachers that are in every school. Some of them belong to an organization, United Teachers of New Orleans. Some of them belong to the American Federation of Teachers, but many of them belong to organizations. So with that being said, if those who are decision makers, begin to have some dialogue with those individuals so that information is heard at the same time, it's accurate, it's informative, and there can be dialogue back and forth. The second thing, and I heard Vera mention this a few minutes ago, is that she uses the variety of social media outlets to inform her parents. And she uses media outlets for those parents who are very young and those parents who are old fogies like me. So, that's a good thing to be able to do that in a variety of ways. And I think, again, and you keep hearing me say the bottom line, most of us don't care if it's a charter school, a direct run school, a private school, or a school of fish. The bottom line is, how do we get quality services to all children? And that's where we go back to the piece about equitable services as opposed to equal. And we have to look at what our needs are, because you just mentioned, Rachel, there is no one size that fits all. So until we get the people who are decision makers to understand what decisions are that need to be made by dialoguing, again, we're going to continue to go around in this circle. Certainly there are going to be some things that get better, but more often than not, you have these consequences, and many of them may be unintended consequences, but they're still consequences. And who do they impact? They impact our children. So, we don't want people to go around with partial information, half information, because as you well know, once the train leaves the station, then whatever information has been given out then, that's the information that's going to be widespread, and it's much more difficult to fix something after it has been broken than to fix it in the beginning.
Agreed. I appreciate your input, Dr. Kilbert. Caroline, can I get something from Caroline, please? Can you offer some solutions for how we can get stakeholder communications into a better position so that we're moving our school systems forward?
Sure. I do think that there's been a lot of progress made in public ed, at a state level, trying to get that information. And in my mind, when we talk about information, that can vary, but let's focus on the data, the things that we feel like as parents, as taxpayers, as business owners, et cetera, we want to know about our schools and the effects it's having on our kids. So whether that's, performance scores, information about suspension, if it's things about, other policies. I'm trying to think, like I was involved with a group at the legislative level led by Representative Pat Smith on student fees. I think that's a good example of how student fee policies vary across all districts and charter schools. And so this group came together to try to figure out, like, how do we get the right information about student fees out to families? So I think that a lot of that sits with, and now I'll hone in on Orleans and the system that we have. This is an opportunity for the Orleans Parish School Board and Superintendent Lewis to set what the vision and the expectations are around this information. And as now more of the authorizer than the operator of schools, they need to create what the mandates are around that information. And they need to be responsible for either putting that out themselves to the public or holding schools that they are accountable for and responsible for doing that properly. So whether that is, expectations on both what should be on your websites, for example, there's a lot of laws about information that must be on websites. So OPSB, are you holding schools accountable to following those laws? There are opportunities, I think, again, as the authorizer, they can insert themselves in areas that they think need to be improved upon. I'll give an example. OPSB, more than several years ago, felt that parents should be part of charter boards. So they set policy that said, have to have boards. That turned into law. So I think that this is an opportunity, as we're trying here, solve moving forward, that Orleans really needs to step up and own that type of information and hold schools accountable to that transparency and those data points that they feel families need to have. I think another example would be in Orleans, we've talked a lot about discipline. There was a time that every school was doing their own expulsions, and it varied across schools how that looked. We created some guardrails, we policymakers, Orleans and others, that unified expulsion so that now all expulsion hearings are at the school district level with Orleans. So just one example to me that leads to greater transparency, consistency, and accuracy there, but it should be owned, I believe, by the district.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Caroline. Just to add to that too, NOLA Public Schools, since the transition, the website contains a great deal of information that, some toolkits, if you will, at the charter board as well as the school leader level to help facilitate those changes and the intention to create more transparency at the school and at the school board level. So it exists, but I'd like to see how this happens, right? We just experienced this transition to NOLA Public Schools. So I guess looking forward, which I really want to see how the availability of that guidance coming from NOLA Public Schools will play out, and whether or not the responsibility will be taken, as you mentioned, Caroline, by that particular entity to make sure it's enforced, to make sure that the work gets done, so that we do keep on moving forward, not just by intention, but in action. I want to go ahead and incorporate another excerpt.
Rachel, I wanted to respond to this question.
No, go right ahead.
First, and I've heard this, I think that to your points, there are a lot of parents who I really do care about, what's happening with my child, and they may not care what type of school their child is placed in, as long as their child's needs are being met. But I just want to say that from the point of Orleans Public Education Network, we do very much care that these things are happening in a public school setting. So we do care whether or not you're able to get a quality education from a public school versus a private school or a parochial school. So I will say that some parents may not care, but from the perspective of Open, we do care that there is public will to have a public school system that can provide a high quality free education to every child in the city. So I will say that. Second thing is that in terms of the good, timely, accurate information, I think that one of the things that we do need to do is not prioritize certain kinds of information over others. I get it. Like, there's a lot of different voices out there, some that are very critical, and very, very loud about their critique, but I think that they also serve a purpose for those folks who may not otherwise be engaged unless it was something controversial for them to be rallied around. And so I think it's important that we have information out there that not just shares with parents what's happening in their school, but also allows them to understand and also be critical about systems and institutions, and to just not just kind of accept these are the policies, this is how it's set up, but to really kind of dive into, all right, this is not a school thing, this is a OPSB thing, or some other kind of thing. It's not about what's happening in your particular school. And I think that we definitely should encourage parents to be critical about systems and put information in front of them that allows them to do that. I do agree with Caroline that, as the authorizer, on the district level, it really is up to OPSB, NOLA public schools to make sure that schools are implementing a lot of these policies that are in place. We have a policy training program. We say it all the time. There are wonderful things written in Louisiana state law that are not actually being implemented in schools and in classrooms, but it's there, it's in the letter of the law. And, there's a state law now that says that there has to be a parent on every school board. That was 2 state legislators ago. There has been no update, though, as to whether or not that has actually happened. If there's anyone on the OPSB, NOLA public school side that is actively looking into that and holding schools accountable for that and reporting it back to the community. So I think that a lot of this communication piece, I really think it's about OPSB stepping in and stepping up and making sure that all of the schools have, crossed their T's and dotted their I's, and they have communicated with families, again, in plain, simple language that's readily and easily available about how they are aligned with the letter of the law. And then also, I think that it's important for, at the basis of all things, I think it's important for parents and students to know their rights in this system, especially as, like Dr. Vera said, you can have 3 different children in 3 different schools. Who may all have their own, culture, policies, and things, but there are district level, state level rights that are inviolable that parents and students should know about when they sign up before the first day of school. So I just wanted to add that.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Nahliah. To add to that perspective, I want to make sure that we get in Mr. Dave Cash's input. Where are you? Here we go. So here's what he has to offer as far as a solution in regards to our communications.
So, okay, I think, this always goes back to me to politics. And when I say politics, I mean power. And the way that the system is designed is that parents don't have a lot of power, and children don't have a lot of power. Students don't have a lot of power. And honestly, teachers don't have a ton of power in the system either. The power is really concentrated at the CMO end of the spectrum. And so we can ask or demand that communication be mandated by policy and describe what kind of that communication looks like. In terms of policies, there's a lot of ways you could go in terms of creating policies. But like I said, I'm not sure how much quality you would get unless you mandated. I suppose you could mandate sort of which metrics. You could get really in the weeds and say we want to know this number, because there's certain numbers, for instance, that are very hard to find. For instance, teacher turnover, right? What is how many teachers started the year? How many teachers ended the year? During that time, how many teachers were terminated? How many teachers left of their own accord? Also, for students, how many students left in the middle of the year? How many parents decided to take their students out of that school? I don't know that there's a lot of those kinds of statistics, but I think they're very telling and, they could be really instructive for parents who are in this system that is, supposedly driven by the idea of parent choice. Although I think that's, I don't think that's as real as it's sold.
Okay. So I included that to help us understand that what we're looking for as far as solutions to this on a higher level, y'all, we know that there are, in fact, powerful ways that we can work from the school to upward to the legislative level. And there is definitely work to be done from the top down. We need to keep perspective in how we're going to solve this problem in a very simplified yet broad and respective way. And that being, we need to honor the fact that we are all lacking. And this is, and when I'm saying all, I'm talking about different levels of the stakeholder community. We are lacking in our ability to communicate well and collaborate well because we're not taught that way. Our children now aren't being taught that way. We weren't taught that way. We don't come from a series of school systems where, no matter where we lived in this country, where we're taught how to collaborate well around the way education is delivered. So the act of solving the problem of not communicating well enough to prevent things like lawsuits, high school graduation debacles, serious accidents, and transportation issues. Our ability to communicate around that and work together from different standpoints, from different entities as stakeholders to see better outcomes and be brave enough to introduce new plans on how education should look from this point forward based upon the student bodies that we're serving at this point. We have to be real about how that looks and how it translates in policy, how it translates at the school level, and how it translates for the way families take in that information. So please, by all means, I want to hear from Dr. Vera and then from Raynard, what your perspective is on how we can solve the issue of where we're lacking in stakeholder communications.
Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is, depending upon who the stakeholder is, right? If it's the family, the parent, whether it's a policymaker or a politician, we need to figure out what information they need to be able to best serve children and families that are impacted by the decisions that are made. I think that the lens has always got to be, and unfortunately, that's part of the problem, it seldom is, but we have to look at everything through the lens of how does this help better educate the child in the seat in the school building? So how does what we do up here trickle down here into the school building? I think that we really need to be looking at everything from that lens, and we need to be asking questions versus assuming that we know what it is that people need, want to hear, and want to be engaged about. There is always going to be a component of the education community that's going to be fighting about something, and that is everybody's right. I think, you know, in many cases, as Nahliah said, it's a good thing that people are not agreeing about everything, because then you get complacency, and from complacency comes mediocrity, and nobody wants that. But at some point, we do also need to just get down to the business of making sure children are educated well from top to bottom, so that the laws that are in place are effective, the finances that are being provided are sufficient, the training that people are getting that are in front of your children every day is quality. Those are the things that I want to be dialoguing about. And I think we have to ask parents. I think the reason why, and we certainly are not perfect, I want to be very clear about that. We're not perfect at it. The reason why we have been able to avoid over the past 3 years some of the pitfalls that other parents or other schools have fallen into is because we ask and we own. So we ask, what is it that you need from us as your school community? And then we own when we make a mistake. And I think that is one of the linchpins that's missing is nobody wants to own when they do something wrong. And so then that creates a distrust. And when people distrust, they don't engage. And so, you know, I think that it's a much more complicated and convoluted issue than we can solve during this 1.5 hour long webinar. But you know, Rachel, I appreciate your ambition around this. And it's been, I think, enlightening to hear other people's perspectives. And I think that Dr. Sanders is right. A lot of mistakes have been made, and there are a lot of bad feelings as a result. And so that impacts the way that people engage, which sometimes can come across as not being positive. But I think any kind of engagement is positive, even when it might be tough, for lack of a better word. So, I mean, I think that's my solution, or a non-solution. Depending upon how you look at it.
Fantastic. Your perspective is perfectly executed in this, because I want us to be able to say the real thing. You know, we're looking at a series of actions that need to be not just reversed, but I mean, visited fully, you know, and how did this happen? And oh my God, it can never happen again. So I appreciate your perspective in that, Dr. Vera. Dr. Raynard, how can we fix this, man?
Well, in response to your question, I think that a lot needs to be done. But I think that we can never, the most important person in the classroom is the teacher. The most important person in the school is the principal. But by the same token, we've got to deal with this governance problem that we have, as I perceive it. Okay, so we have some schools that are doing good and some schools that are not doing good. But yet we have a system that, by and large, where the charter schools are unaccountable to the public. And they're unaccountable to the public merely because we have a policy in place where we have given all of the power over to charter school boards. I don't think that we should have a system, whether it's a charter or non-charter school board, that where the schools operate in an unaccountable fashion, as they say, as we've said early on here, where we have bad actors, where we have people that are not following policy, and there's nothing that you can do about it. So when you look at Act 91, Act 91 specifically neuters the local school board, such that the charter school board has all the authority over everything over daily practice. Now we have this fiasco going on over at Kennedy. We have this fiasco going over at Cog Hill, and this, that, and the other. The realities are that the policy says, the state policy says, right, that all of those operations are under the jurisdiction of the charter school board. And the charter school board can have some input from the Orleans Parish School Board with their permission. Something is wrong. These charter school boards are contractors. Why are we in a situation where we have given the daily operation authority totally over to a charter school board with, by policy, no interference by a local governing authority? So what can the school board do? I mean, exactly, what exactly can they do? If the school decides tomorrow, well, we're gonna fire all the teachers and do DVDs, or are we gonna do this, that, and the other? Are we gonna do, and we think that this is the right thing to do? Are we gonna do stuff that is totally against practice? Or we're not gonna serve special needs kids? Okay, all right? So we have to really look at this whole governance situation and redo this governance situation and not have the tail wagging the dog. You know, all schools need to be accountable. And right now we have an unaccountable system that can't fix itself. And until we solve that, we're gonna have the bad actors. We're gonna have some charter schools that do good, but I guarantee you that most of the charter schools that service poor and minority kids are gonna be our worst schools because they don't care anything about those kids. And unless we get people in there that care about them and a governance policy that ensures that equity practices and best practices are put in place, we're whistling Dixie.
Raynard, if I may, Rachel.
Go right ahead.
We had schools that had autonomy pre-Katrina, and it was simply called best practices that were based upon the school improvement plan. And every school turned in a school improvement plan, and they did whatever it was that they thought was in the best interest based upon the improvement needs that were determined by a committee of people, including parents, including the business community, including the educators at the school. So this is nothing new to have autonomy at a school. However, the difference is now, as you just mentioned, Act 91 tends to hamstring the school board where it is limited in the decisions that it can make, or to limits the input that it can provide based upon best practices. So until, again, we sit down, and Rachel, you've taken on a task here, talking about communication, we have to get to the root of it, and that is to sit down and have some dialogue, and not just dialogue, but discussion and dialogue with answers.
I appreciate that, Dr. Kilbert. Thanks for your input. And to address that last thing you said, yes, I've taken on a task by taking on communication, but rest assured, y'all, again, I picked y'all for a reason. And I want to make sure that this work continues in such a way that it produces something, really useful for years to come. We have to get this to work well for our children and our grandchildren, because the fate of our state rests on it. We've got to do well, regardless of the basket that's been handed to us. We've got to make the best possible harvest from it. So here we are. With that said, y'all, we are out of time. But I want to address one last thing. I want to make sure that we all have a resolve today coming out of this conversation. Because the main reason that I've asked you all to participate today is really to hear from you what commitment you could make toward doing better with communications. How are you either currently or planning to work on communication in such a way that your stake in the public education community is improving, is moving forward, is bringing together those things? And here's a key word, a big word that I've heard a few times, but we really need to focus on learning how to do it, is how can we put our resolve into collaborating the efforts, agreeing to disagree, meeting of the minds, diversified thought, professional diversity and development. All of those things need to come into our resolve. How can we collaborate on moving forward for having better stakeholder communications that yield more resources, better communication, higher function, more effectiveness, and ultimately, better student outcomes. We have to yield better student outcomes as a result of our communications. So what is everyone doing? And anyone can take this first. What are you all doing in order to move that forward? What's your agenda?
I'll go last and close out. So I'll let Dr. Sanders and Dr. Kilbert go first.
Thanks, Nahliah.
Well, since 2009, I have been involved with a weekly radio show called the New Orleans Imperative. For 7 years, I was on WBOK. And for the last, well, 2.5 years now, I've been on, well, last year and a half, I've been on WHIV. And that is to present to the public information that the mainstream media was not presenting to the public, and to talk about things, and also to give voice to the voiceless. So for the last 9 years, we've had students to come on, we've had parents to come on, we've had groups to come on, we've had a number of individuals who came on who talked about their inability to participate as stakeholders. I will continue to do that, via radio, and also through another organization which I work, which is just called the New Orleans Educational Equity Roundtable. Because even though I wasn't part of planning this seminar, you cannot do this without the people that's involved. And until you figure out a way to get them actively involved and feel like they are a part of it, and that their responses and what their needs and wants are turning into action, then we're not going to be successful, plain and simple, on a whole lot of fronts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanders. Dr. Kilbert?
Thank you, Rachel. One of the things that I got engaged in after retirement, so to speak, is being involved in an organization called the Algebra Project. And the Algebra Project is an organization that brings support to schools to address the needs of the young people who are at the bottom quartile, and to see what is the best way to teach teachers how to teach to involve those young people. The other thing that another organization that I belong to is an organization called NOLA, Black Educators of New Orleans, Louisiana. And what our mission is to address the needs of those schools that are Black-led, Black-governed. And it doesn't mean that it only has to have Black students or Black individuals who work there, but to address the needs of those schools that are not getting the kinds of resources that the schools that do not look like the schools that we work with are getting. Also, I want to say that on the mailing list of Open, and will continue to be on the mailing list of Open, because I think that is a great venue that provides information to the mainstream. And with that, there are those that I know that for whatever reason are not on the mailing list, are just not engaged. I send them information so that they can be engaged and can be aware of what's going on. And there are also a plethora of other organizations that I belong to that engage. But my commitment simply is this. My commitment is to please keep me engaged. Please keep me informed, because I will say this. For whatever successes that I've been able to arrive at, it was because somebody took the time to look after me and to assist me. And I am responsible and accountable to do the same thing, even more so with those persons who come behind me. And we all use the same adage: we stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before us. Although my shoulders may not be as broad, maybe not be as big, but certainly I would like to be able to continue to provide support, resources, information, whatever expertise some may think that I might have, and whether they use it or not, again, it's just another tool that can go in their bag of tools. So please continue to keep me informed, keep me in the loop, so that I can be able to share or distribute or provide support to those who are in need.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kilbert. We appreciate your commitment to continuing this work. Nahliah?
Yes. So as Dr. Kilbert mentioned, we do have this newsletter, which is it has grown since we started it. We realized that people really don't know what's going on in the landscape. And they're asking us, who's doing what. We get a lot of requests about folks who need advocacy on some level and not knowing who the groups are. So that's kind of how it started, right? So if you need special education resources, there's Pyramids, there's Bright Minds, there's, SBLC, there's Agenda, and so we were trying to put a resource kind of newsletter together in the beginning, but then also there's never a dull moment in the public education system in New Orleans. I say sometimes it's like a show written by Shonda Rhimes, like there's always some kind of new drama going down in the school system, and so people need to be aware of that as well. Again, some of the it might be another school, it may seem like it doesn't pertain to you or your child's immediate needs, but a lot of the stories that do come out are at least cautionary tales, right? Things that you should be mindful of in your school. When we're hearing that schools are getting shut down, not because their grades were bad, but because of board malfeasance, then you need to be thinking, well, I like my school and my child is doing well, but who is on my board? What are they up to? We have schools that it's not just the F schools that can get closed. I mean, we saw that before, or taken over. We saw that with Harney, right? We saw that it had nothing really to do. They had, in the same year that they got a major, they got recognized for growth, is the same year that their charter might have been pulled because of what was happening on the board side and, and all that kind of stuff. So we put that newsletter together for that. We got some really great engagement. And we also want to promote, people out there that are really trying to bring great programs and resources to the community. So we're going to continue to do that. And we're going to continue to grow our communications platforms. We are where the young parents are. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. We have our newsletter, we have our website, and we're going to continue to try to not just put information in front of people or explain policies to people, but really, present information to people in a way that they can actually absorb it and use it. Policy is full of a lot of jargon, it's full of a lot of acronyms, it's full of a lot of SAT words that are unnecessary. And I think that's intentional, and it pushes people out of the conversation. And so we're trying to be more intentional about making the information as accessible as possible and growing our communications platform and having folks like you, the panelists today, and others being part of that conversation. I don't think that any organization should say, we are the voice of the people, but rather we are a platform where the people can speak and share what their perspectives and their opinions are. So Open is going to continue to do that. And thank you for being a part of this work. You brought this wonderful panel together, and we're putting this out there in the public, and this is information and perspectives that they otherwise would not have had. So thank you very much.
No, Nahliah, thank you for the opportunity, because I'm very comfortable with speaking with our panelists today. And thank you so much for sharing with us how Open is making waves and the way information is transitioned to something useful for families and being able to convey what they need for their children into not just the schools, but into the school systems. So thank y'all for that work. Thank you for having me along. Thank you for taking this on, because it's a big one. But again, I will say it over and over again, this will continue. Dr. Vera and Caroline were not able to close with us, but we will follow up with them and keep them in the loop to make sure that they're included in the follow-up communications. Everyone, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate Caroline coming in, offering her perspective on making sure we clearly identify the lines between what involvement is and who should be involved in it. I definitely appreciate Dr. Vera's living example of what the exception to the rule could be and how that exception can actually be diversified and used in other schools so that we are serving all children, just in different locations and in different ways. Thank you so much, Dr. Sanders, for bringing reality to us in a way that we feel the weight of it and can move forward, pick it up, move forward, and actually consciously think about the way we involve ourselves in how school education is delivered. Dr. Kilbert, thank you for your time, your wisdom, and your expertise. And I know this about you. I know that you've served virtually every position that there is in OPSB. So I trust not just your opinion, but your guidance in the way this work gets done, because you've seen it all. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for that. Nahliah, thank you again for the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Rachel Guidry. I'm gonna put my information up.
Yep.
Let's see. This is how y'all can get in touch with me.
Nice.
So
Nice.
my consultancy is located in Mid-City at the corner of South Jeff Davis and Banks. If you want to schedule an appointment to come and see me just to talk about it. But I live and breathe policy, to quote my former professor, Dr. Kathleen Fitzgerald over at Loyola University. I am a natural born sociologist. So this is the work that I live for. I look forward to working with you all in the very near future about how we're going to keep this moving forward from all sides. Thanks again for your time. Thanks to everyone that showed up today, and thanks to everyone that's in. Please make sure you do your part. Our kids are dependent on you, on me, on everyone, to make sure that we provide them a better future to work from. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.